Welcome back, everyone, to NeuroAlchemy, a neurosynergy podcast, where we explore the meeting place between science, soul, and the non-linear path of becoming. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Young. Here we define every term as if you're hearing it for the very first time, because clarity creates safety, and safety opens the doorway to more healing opportunities and allows more change to be possible. And I am so excited today. We are coming out from Michigan, which is where we're located. And I'm so excited to have one of our local practitioners here to talk with us today. Today's conversation is one that I believe many clinicians, practice owners, and helpers need. A conversation about the healers behind the healing and the systems that they work inside. I'm joined today by Patrick Eilers, a counselor of 10 years and the founder of Bloomwork Concepts and Coaching, where he supports practice owners in developing healthier, more sustainable mental health businesses. Patrick, we are so glad you're here to share with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And yes, we are local, and this is the first time I've been on a podcast that's been local. So that's also a first for me. So.
Absolutely. What's one word that you might use to describe how you arrived today, either physically, emotionally, or energetically?
I think I'm just excited to share. I think this is usually when I'm on podcasts, I talk a lot about sort of myself as a clinician. Really, I don't usually talk too much about my business side of it. So it's kind of nice. I've been transitioning more into that. But if you've heard me on any previous podcasts or anything like that, you're going to hear me talk about sex addiction and a lot about the clinician world of that. But I'm looking forward to today. I'm excited to be able to talk a little bit different conversation. I might not be as fluid, but I think it's going to be a good practice for me in that sense to talk more about it.
Very good. Very good. And before we talk about your work, what's something that brings you meaning or energy in this season of your life?
Yeah. I think the big thing right now, and this has been a huge year of learning for me. I started this business at the end of last year and kind of was hoping to do this full time. I still am, and I eventually probably will get there at some point, but a lot of learning, a lot of ability, or sort of, I guess not ability, but certainly flexibility in what happened. I mean, I've been contracting with a couple other places, and I've really been able to kind of get back into kind of being a general practitioner. So I'm working with a lot of different people currently, and I really like the clients I'm working with, and it's nice to kind of get back into that setting because I previously worked in sort of like a specialty space for the previous 4 years. So I'm just grateful for the fact that I get an opportunity to walk with people and their experiences and just kind of be back to kind of getting back to my like previous skills and kind of like really being able to embrace those again. Like I said, it's been a little while since I got a chance to kind of get into that space. So it's kind of nice to be there.
Very wonderful. To ground our listeners, I'd love to begin with some shared language. So when you talk about practice culture, how can you define that in a simple, everyday way?
Actually, really where a lot of those conversations in my own head came from, really were starting about, when I listen to sports talk radio and you listen to people talk about the Lions, being local, right? Like the Detroit Lions, if anyone out there knows, they don't have a great history of being successful. And they've had many losing seasons up until they brought Dan Campbell in. And so a lot of what the conversations around that have been about, how he changed the culture of the team and how it became about a standard and how they were, how they draft and the people that they put in place and the certain kind of people they're looking for. And so that really was kind of the first place in my own mind where I started thinking about like, that's true for a lot of like any kind of business, but certainly when you're talking about practitioners, I mean, that's a space that, I certainly think that word has a lot of meaning. So for me in the everyday, it's really about trying to find a sort of a standard and understanding your vision related to the clients you're working with. So Simon Sinek's book about what's your why. I read that book and that really kind of put me in sort of that position of, okay, like how can I bring the same concept to practices? And so really about helping owners of practices try to meet what their actual goal of is, whether that be to try to, touch as many people's lives as they can, or if that's, hey, we're working with a specific diagnosis because I have a background in that, or maybe I have a family member or some type of history connected to that. So really culture is about trying to find the standard. And I think also then being able to build off that standard and meet the needs of the people that are coming in. and that you work with.
You often name the pitfalls that mental health practices faced. What does that word encompass for you?
Pitfalls. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that can be described there. I guess I'd say, the way I look at it is that when a practice can get splintered, that's a big pitfall, right? Everybody kind of loses their synergy. They don't engage with each other the same way they might when they're sort of all congruent in that sense. So I would maybe use the word incongruent. When you're incongruent, that tends to be a pitfall for most practices, because you got one person doing their own thing over here, you got another person doing their own thing over here. It sets the practice up for not a lot of success. You're going to have some failure, not because just because the fact that there is an incongruency, but certainly the idea of that incongruency leading to potentially even legal issues. Certainly if people are doing their own thing, it puts the practice, I think, at sort of a risk. But so as an owner, how can we, sort of be congruent and bring all of our team members to kind of together and to be working toward a common goal in helping the people that are coming in that we're working with in that level. So that's kind of the way I look at pitfalls. What are the things that kind of keep us from getting to that the goal?
And when you talk about therapist burnout or turnover, what does that actually look and feel like from the inside?
Well, my experience with burnout is not so much that I don't want to go to work, but it is just the overwhelming inability to shut off work, right? It's I take work to a lot of different places it shouldn't be, right? I lose my boundaries, so to speak. I think that's one aspect of burnout. Another aspect I would say as well, turnover. We talk about basically, people leaving their place of employment. So essentially, people come in, they may work for a little while, they never really get established in the culture or in the built business or in the vision of the business, and they end up leaving. Some practices you need to spend some time with, like the one I said, when I was specialized, I knew kind of going in, I was going to probably be working for a while in that field. Even if I didn't really like it, I was going to have to learn it because it was a program I'd learn. So I gave it 4 years because I kind of wanted to see myself go through the whole program myself of kind of learning how to implement it. So I kind of knew that going in, but I felt like by year 3, I kind of knew like, hey, this is probably not going to be for me long term. And at that point, I was kind of being like asked to commit to that longer. And so I kind of knew that was going to be for me. That was going to be where my turnover, my burnout was going to come, because that wasn't my population I wanted to stay in working in. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think that's kind of where I think about it, is that, I don't feel aligned with this particular section, or maybe the way that we're implementing this therapy, or that we're trying to help people, whatever that may look like. So burnout in that way, I think, is a big part of people's experiences.
Absolutely. You've been a licensed professional counselor for 10 years. What experiences led you to begin supporting practice owners?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of different experiences working in different sections of the field. So when I started my career, I was actually working in Saginaw, Michigan, at a place up there, a pretty good sized practice, probably 35 to 40 clinicians in that range, plus caseworkers. So it was a little bit more like a community mental health kind of setting. So I worked with a lot of different people up there. And I did see that, you talked about that splintering earlier. I saw like people all over across the board there, as far as, styles and the way people worked and the way things were and how things were incongruent. Basically, is the fact that there was not synergy in the building. Basically, everybody kind of was, you're an independent practitioner, but you're under one roof. And although there is some strengths to that for some degree, and so you're able to meet a lot of needs of people in a greater sense, it doesn't bring a lot of strength or stability or continuity within the coworkers. I felt like that was one of the big things. There was a lot of infighting in that particular space. So a lot of people were like, don't, this person isn't doing it the right way. This person is doing it the wrong way. Like a lot of that kind of stuff. So, great space to learn from when you're a new clinician, because you get to see a lot of things, but on the downside, you don't feel very supported. So that was kind of my first experience. Then I went out of the field for a little bit. I switched my license. I was originally a psychologist. I switched to LPC. For those who don't know what that's, licensed professional counselor. So I switched my license. I actually was teaching for a while. I taught at Concordia University here in Ann Arbor, and I also taught at the Jackson Prison for a while. And then when I got done with that and I switched my license, I actually went to a startup practice, which is really cool because we were kind of starting our own culture, right? We knew what we were going to start from. We were, brand new practice. It was expanding from a previously established practice. So we kind of had our own thing. We were real close with each other because we knew that everybody kind of knew each other. We felt comfortable with the way we did everything and the way the protocols were and everything that was in place. Due to the pandemic and some other stuff that had happened, that practice ended up not continuing. So that's why I ended up going into the specialty space. And working in that space is really where I started to kind of get the idea, like I see this as a need. Like I've been at 3 different practices and the experience has been vastly different. There's no standard here. So when I got into the specialty space, I was able to work more of like a very that was a very, very clinical setting. It was very much more like almost like a doctor type of setting. Like that was the expectation. So very much different from like a, traditional type of mental health space typically, because it was very focused on just kind of like this program and how the program was going to be executed, most kind of thing. So for me, at the end of that, I started thinking, okay, like, well, I think there's a lot of need for this. I hear a lot from people that, they're struggling trying to find, kind of what works for them. And if the practices had more standard, more continuity, that would really help, I think, clinicians wanting to stay places. And again, seeing the turnover, just even in my own experience, a lot of people would come, they'd be there for a few months, they'd be gone. So again, how do you establish a healthy rapport with your clients, but also how do you establish a somewhat of all the people that I've seen that have had success in the field have basically found a place and they've stayed there and they just keep working with that particular population, or if they're in private practice, they just continue to work on their own practice. Financially, those are the people that are most stable. And unfortunately, the field doesn't always promote financial stability anyway. But then on top of that, you add constantly moving around like I have, you start to not have a lot of financial stability over a period of time because you're always rebuilding a caseload all the time. So I think that's a big part of it too, is like if you're a clinician, how many times can you really move until you get to a point where you're just like, I don't want to build in our caseload. I built so many of these, I'm tired of that. Right. So I think there's a part of that comes into play. Like, that's we talk about burnout. That's a part of the burnout process, right? Is that you're always constantly in the new and you're always trying to not sure, where your stability is going to come from in that sense. So I do think there's an aspect of that if the practice is more stable, you'll see clinicians be more stable in that way. So it's good for everybody's mental health to be in a more stabilized environment, because that gives them much more of a safety of wanting to be able to work there and stay there and work through things that may come up within the practice in order to be able to meet the needs of the clients that they're serving. So that's a big part of where I think I started to kind of see that as a need.
So when I hear you talk, I'm kind of I see things visually a lot of times. It's kind of seems like part of what you do is when you're working with practices, everything's kind of incongruent or out of sync or out of alignment. And that lack of resonance and synergy is what creates a lot of problems in practices. And so, if I understand you correctly, when you're coming in and you're working with these practices, you're bringing them from a place of incongruency into synergy and alignment with what their company missions are, but not only that, as well as the individual clinicians themselves and what they bring to the team to kind of amplify that culture that we're talking about, which is also related to how we feel in our workspace, how our clients feel when they walk into the door of that space, how we connect together and with each other. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, most of that stuff is all part of it. I think, when you talk about what I would say from a perspective of clinicians' specialties, people have all different kinds of experiences. And so can we pull from those in order to be able to make the overall practice healthier and be able to utilize everybody's skills uniquely in that sense? So I do think there is a piece of that. Kind of the main thing that we do really try to put some system implementation in place. We try to help people with being able to scale their business in a practical way. So certainly like going from, if you're a solo practitioner and you want to expand, doing that responsibly. So I do think that's something that happens a lot in the field that is not responsible. They tend to sort of do it based on need. And then just kind of coaching through some specific issues that come up in each individual practice, because everybody's practice is unique in its own way. And then the last part is in really also defining our roles. So part of it is knowing each of our roles, not only as admins, but also as clinicians and also as the owner. But it's also being able to find people who align as you're interviewing people and finding people who are going to be a good fit for that particular practice. One of the things that I just said that typically tends to happen is that when people expand their practice, they look for the need rather than necessarily the right fit for the person. So when they interview based on what's your clinical, which again you need to certainly what's your licensure and all those kind of things, but looking for the right person that's going to expand your therapeutic presence. Because you as the owner, that's what you're trying to get, right? You're the public to have a therapeutic presence beyond just the doors of the building that you're in. And that's where a lot of owners struggle, I think, is being in dual roles. So like they're both an owner and a clinician. And a lot of times when you're in school, you don't learn how to be able to run a practice. You're just basically taught how to run a session. And you can't take that same type of structure and put that into a business. It just doesn't work. You have to kind of learn how to be able to balance between the two. And I think you have to give up a little bit of your clinical caseload or your clinical experience to some degree experience, probably not the right word, but basically you have to give up a little bit of your caseload in that sense in order to be an owner. If you, the bigger your practice is, the more of your personal caseload has to diminish, in my opinion, because otherwise you're just going to be consistently torn between those two things. And that gets overwhelming for the owner. And then they're working like 70, 80 hours a week and the practice is in chaos. So you have to kind of find that balance between, okay, am I going to devote one day to being a clinician? The other 4 days I'm an owner. Depending on how many people I have working under me, I may need to do that. But maybe if I only have one person working under me, I can do 3 days as a clinician and 1 day as an owner. But I think you have to find that balance. If you don't find that balance, that's going to be a big part of where a lot of these things are going to get incongruent.
Was there a moment, maybe even a breaking point or a breakthrough, when you realized the business side of therapy needed healing too?
I mean, I think even all the way back to when I started, I think I saw that, certainly within the incongruence of the first place I worked at. And I think mostly it was because, I mean, it really kind of got reinforced more because I do have the training for supervision for other LPCs. And so when I took that training, the consistent message that came up from people's experiences were that when they were being supervised, they didn't have a good supervision experience. And a lot of that was coming from a place that typically if you worked under an owner, the owner is kind of your supervisor in that case. So again, when there's so much chaos going on, if you take on as an owner, you take on that responsibility of being a supervisor, you have to then also step into that role too. So there's a lot of roles you get kind of pulled apart. And I think I saw it pretty much early on in the field. Like there's a lot of, like, I only thought it was that one place. It was my first place I worked at. I was like, oh, it must just be this place. And then every other place I've interviewed or different place I've gone or whatever, there's always pros and cons, but certainly majority of the places I've seen that this has been a consistent thing. And when I looked at the research, Michigan did research for CMH specifically, and that's where the 40% turnover rate came from, was that their research was that it was 40% for clinicians to come in. Now that might be CMH exclusively. I don't know if that necessarily represents everybody in the field, but what I see is that there's more and more people going into solo work because they don't like something about the practices. And I do think that there comes a point where how does that continued splintering in the field affect the field in the long term? Because if everybody's working solo, I mean, that there's some strengths to that probably, but then there's also some weaknesses to that. There's not a lot of therapist to therapist support. And so that's where you start to kind of run into those kind of things. So I think for me, it's been kind of a combination of my own experience of seeing that, but then also seeing it just observation through and listening to our people and our other people I've worked with and stuff.
In your work with practice owners, what do you see as the most common stressors that lead to burnout or
Well, I think the big things that I've seen have been really like time management and the inability to sort of just separate from those roles that we were talking about. Certainly there is an element of things like billing and all those kind of things. And those are, how much of that stuff do you do in-house? How much of that stuff do you do outside of there? It depends on the practice. Some practices can probably get away with, having more in-person, in-house type of stuff and working with billing and those kind of things. And you can do it on your own. Other practices really need to have that be outsourced. But I do think as an owner, like I said, it's that kind of dual role space. It's I get to be a clinician some of this time, but then when I'm done being a clinician, I have to then take calls for the ownership part of it, or I have to take calls of being a supervisor, or I have to do other things over here that I don't necessarily either A, know how to do, or B, really want to do, or whatever the case is. Another thing I've seen that's been a pretty impactful piece, I think, at least from my experience, has been that people who, like, if they're a clinician in their second career, so to speak, like, so let's say they did something beforehand, or they worked in some other type of, health space, and they become their second career is to be a clinician. They bring a lot of those types of things in as structure because that's what they know. And a lot of times that doesn't translate very well into mental health. I mean, I think there's probably some crossover that can certainly be used, but a lot of times that's usually where, like, so for example, if you're into like business, some type of business sales or something like that, or you're into like some other type of, business world type of things, you might know how to be able to set a business up, but trying to bring that same structure into mental health can be really tricky because now you're kind of not able to meet people the same way as you would have because it's not a sales job, right? It's a different type of connection. So I think there's a little bit of that does happen into play too, or people maybe having a second career or changing and they're bringing their previous experience, but doesn't always necessarily translate, or learning how the language translates the way that most effectively, I think, is a good.
What do you wish more owners understood about the emotional, relational, and systemic load their clinicians are carrying?
What I've discovered, so in the course of, I think I mentioned earlier, when I did the supervision course, I'm now part of the same person who ran the supervision course actually started what they call a clinical empowerment group. And so it's for clinicians to get together and kind of spend time talking and kind of connecting and those kind of things and just talk about being therapists. One of the unanimous things that seems to come up a lot is that people feel or have felt like they've been in a position where either if they work under somebody or they work or they are an owner themselves, to connect with the idea that like being a clinician is hard and it's also being human, which are wonderful things in themselves. But when you're in those spaces, what ends up happening is, just understanding that that's a tough job. And as an owner, how do you respect what people's, as clinicians, what they are going through in those kind of ways and being able to support that? And I think there's always this belief that like, okay, well, as long as they're handling it well, that they're going to be the ones that are going to come to me and talk about it. But I think it's also somewhat of a practice's responsibility to provide safe spaces for the clinicians to be able to be support one another. If you go to work and none of your colleagues are going to talk to you for the entire day, that isn't really a great feeling. I mean, you're not going to really want to stay there very long. But that's kind of the world of a clinician, right? Is you tend to be in this position where you're relatively isolated from people that are with you work with, right? You only are like, you're very connected to people, but they're people that you're helping. They're not necessarily people that you're colleagues with. So I do think there is an element of isolation that comes with people. And the further that happens, it seems like that is another big part of the splintering is that, you have one person who wants to work 70 hours a week and you have another person who wants to work 7 hours a week. That's another part of that splitting. So how do you bring those people together so that they feel like they're on the same mission, maybe not as often together working the same way, but they're together going in the same direction, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. But so I do feel like there's a lot of isolation. And so when you're outside of that, that's a pretty heavy burden to carry, just because, again, how do you connect with people that are outside of, or within the practice in a way that's going to be practical for everyone. So you can be able to feel like you're, a team to some degree.
Have you noticed any patterns that quietly destabilize practices, ones that people maybe overlook until they are in a full-blown crisis?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a direct, like, yes, it's this thing or that thing. I think there's just like human beings, right? Just like people we work with as a clinician, it's mindset, so how much of your mindset is about, and again, like we said, being in a mental health practice, there's a level of it being a business. Absolutely. We want to honor that part. But there's another part of it that comes down to being people, and whether that be clinicians or clients, you're still dealing with people. And so there has to be some level of that has to be still part of your guiding force, so to speak, of what you're doing. If you strictly make it about money and you strictly make it about just how many people can we get in the door today, you'll lose sight of a lot of that, because I think what ends up happening is your only focus becomes on something that's material that takes away, it basically diminishes your care, because you're only focused on basically the number and not focused on really what the outcome is. And so that is a unique part of being being in the mental health space, is that how do we find that balance? And that's not an easy balance for anyone. It's a clinician between, like I said, being financially stable or working toward a certain amount of money, but also at the same time being able to respect and honor the people we're working with. That's far more important than necessarily the finding how much money you're going to make. If I made $10,000 less, but I made 20,000% more impact, and for example, I would rather take that. And maybe that's just me. Maybe that's just how I'm wired. But I think that the reality of it is the fact that like there needs to be some level of checks and balances in that, because that's a slippery slope. I mean, I think the first thing you do is you see, okay, I've experienced this as an owner too in my own business. Like, okay, I see this big money, but I owe this, I got to make that up. So, how much of my mindset is focused on that number that I haven't met versus, how many people I can impact. I think that it does come down to how much of my focus is about outcomes versus dollars in that way.
You launched Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching with a mission to improve therapist work culture. What does a healthy mental health business environment actually look like?
And the cheating answer would be to tell you that everybody is different and every place is different. But I think that to give you a little bit of framework on that, I think is that there has to be, number one, I think an owner has to be willing to be okay with delegating some level of authority to certain aspects of their practice. I think they have the ultimate authority, yes, but they need to have a trusted clinician or a trusted admin, maybe both, depending on the size, that are going to be part of that, everyday execution. Obviously, administrative type folks are the ones that are going to be working with kind of face to face with the client, that are maybe not in the therapy setting, but they're going to be running that day-to-day part of it. but also having a trusted clinician that the other clinicians respect and trust as well. So part of my model that I came up with actually it's basically like a clinical manager essentially. But they're also a therapist, and they're a therapist that basically gets voted in every couple of years. So basically they have a term period. So if they leave, obviously you're going to invite somebody new, or you're going to vote for somebody new. But if you're staying the whole 2 years, basically at that 2-year mark, you get re-voted if you want to be, you can do the same role, or does we change this person? So I think, but it has to be somebody that the owner trusts as well, because if the owner doesn't trust them, there's not going to be any type of authority there. And so I guess what I'm getting at is trust is a major part in that space. Like, you have to have trust within the people you hire, within the hierarchy of you have to trust the authority of those people. So I do think a healthy practice is a place of trust. It also is a place that people know that they're going to have that level of support there when they need it. So yes, clinician A may never reach out and have help, majority of the time they'll be good, but clinician B may need that. So how often do we continue to have, regular meetings to come together and be supportive of one another, and to, hey, like, whatever that may look like. And again, every practice is a little different, but having those regular anticipatory times, so hey, you're not just going to be out here floating by yourself. That's how I felt, especially at the beginning of my career. I felt like I was the only person in the ocean. That was it. Everybody else was miles away. And so that's really kind of the way that, we try to eliminate some of that, because we don't want clinicians to feel isolated in that sense. So I think trust is the first part. Second part is being able to have regular, consistent amount of time, support, and connection. And then the third part probably would be then respect. That kind of comes with that, right? Is that that you have an open door policy with the owner. The owner is willing to talk with you, meet with you, make time for you. I think that's a big thing. Like, if you're an owner and you're doing something else when in the midst of a phone call is supposed to be with somebody that you work with that's working for you, they need to have your attention. That's how you treat a client. That the clinicians need to have the same equal amount of treatment. Work for places that doesn't happen, right? You call and they're doing something else, so they're distracted. They got this thing going on. They can only give you 5 minutes or whatever. Like, there has to be a structured, if you're going to be an owner, that's where you're giving up. You might be giving up some money. You might be giving up some parts of yourself on the therapist side of it, but you're gaining that in the other side of it as an owner. Like, that's all part of ownership responsibility. And so I think a healthy practice has a lot of those things consistently. That's a big part of it. Again, it's not about being perfect with it, but it's about how do you execute those things on a fairly regular basis, so that's not so it just doesn't become a place where everybody's just doing their own thing, because that's, they said, splintering is what happens very quickly in that sense.
To refine that answer just a little bit, what changes, even simple ones, make the greatest difference in lowering stress and supporting clinicians?
Well, certainly, I think one thing I would say for sure is at least having a monthly meeting coming together, or a monthly time you're going to be able to spend, and not make it about case consultation. Like, case consultation is kind of a separate one. I mean, certainly you need to do that if you're, especially if you're a supervisor. But if you're going to be in a position where you're going to, be a regular owner, have a regular owners meeting, excuse me, and make sure that time is actually dedicated for that, with really no agenda. It's just really about, hey, checking in with everybody. And I think beyond that is also understand that it's not the same meeting every time. Like, it can't be, hey, we're going to talk about all the progress we've made, or hey, we're going to talk about, what the vision of the practice is every time. Like, it needs to be more of an open forum type meeting where, like, everybody has an opportunity to share, and that everybody's committed to dedicating that time. If you make it so that, hey, like, we're only going to let this time be for people who want to come, you may never get that. So, like, making sure that there's a dedicated offset to that. Like, if you're going to say, okay, we're going to give this hour up, but we're going to give you this hour back for your client time, you can do that, something like that, where you're having that consistency. Because the worst thing you can do is only have those meetings every so often. And when those meetings come up, then they're basically just about, something that you've already heard before. The worst thing you can do as a clinician going into something and you feel like it's like when you have to do retraining for, CMH or those kind of things, or like, any type of training, retraining or something like that, update training. It's the same kind of thing. You're listening to something you've already heard before, and you're really checked out in that sense. So it's like one of those things where, can you have that meeting be consistent and be able to be something that people can look forward to? Well, that's the other thing. Like, it can't just be, hey, we're dreading to go to this, otherwise nobody's going to want to go. So I do think it's a practical thing you can start doing pretty quickly, is just implementing something like that, where there's some level of consistency with it, and and that's a dedicated, agreement upon everybody that's in the practice.
What helps a team feel more grounded, valued, and stable?
Well, I think that I would go back to some things with, what makes clients feel that way. Certainly the idea of being heard is a big thing. being able to be reflective on the things that you're hearing, not trying to be a therapist to another therapist. That's a pretty common thing that I've noticed with other colleagues, that sometimes they have a hard time getting out of that mode, and you can be venting about something and all of a sudden they're asking you questions as if like you're in session. No, we're not in session here. We're just connecting as people. It's all good. So I think just, being able to be honest, and also, knowing that like, hey, we're going to hear and listen to what's going on. We're going to listen to what's happening. We may not even have an immediate implementation. We need to make a change, but we're willing to hear what people's concerns are. So I think that's a big part of it. And also expecting respect between clinicians and admin, I think, is another thing too. Like, there's been so many places I've worked at where admins are looked completely differently on than therapists are, whether it be an owner or the therapist to admins. And I just think that's just a terrible thing in that way. Like, they're doing some of the in some ways, more difficult work of them what a clinician's doing. And if you can't respect what they're going to do and value that, then, then I really don't feel like that's a good fit in general of being in that place, because you're going to be, basically creating more cultural issues by doing that. And again, so, how do you see other people? How do you see other admins, people that maybe that are quote unquote lesser than you in the power rankings and stuff like that? Like, there really should just be, hey, we're all together and we're all on the same kind of level with that. So I don't want to say anything offensive in those words. It's just about the fact that it feels like that's very common for people to, at least in the practices I've been around, there's been a lot of that, hey, you're not doing the same kind of work I'm doing. And that's not really, I think, a very fair approach to that. We're just helping in a different way.
What are practice owners most afraid of when they reach out to you initially?
Well, so far from my experience, it's been that it's not their practice that's the problem. So I haven't really had a lot of people been reaching out and saying, hey, like, I really want to work with you, in the sense that, hey, like, I think what you have is really valuable and we can really figure out how to make that work. It's a lot of, sounds like it's a great idea and we really want to support you on that. And I think there's a lot of people who could use it, but those are the people that don't, those might be the people who actually really need to talk to me. And those are the ones that don't. So I get a lot of that where, or I get people outside the field a lot. If you go on like Alignable or LinkedIn or whatever, and you kind of meet other business owners, they're like, they don't really understand what you do or what specifically, why that's an issue, those kind of things. A lot of people are not aware of the problems that are in mental health. I certainly think there's even clinicians who are, this is just how it is. And there's a lot of attitude of, well, this is just how it is and it sucks and nobody's going to do anything about it. So we're just going to just keep on pressing forward. And I don't think that's a good attitude either, but that's kind of where I think there's some people who are kind of like, it's hard to see some of those things because there are a lot of nuances, I think, in it. Like, certainly, obviously, like we were talking about earlier, financial stability and like the aspect of insurance and those kind of things. Like, that's stuff that's just part of being in the field. That's how I would look at it. But that doesn't mean your practice has to suck just because the fact that part of it sucks, So that's where I think that's where I would say people probably struggle the most with, is that they have a hard time looking in their own mirror and saying, yeah, you know what, it is my practice, it is my life, it's my stability, whatever, that's struggling. And I can kind of understand that a little bit. I mean, there's different periods in history we've seen when people try to dual role things, they don't really, they end up losing out on both sides of those things. I used football as an example earlier. There's very few two-way players in the NFL that are on offense and defense. And so that's because one side's going to suffer over the other. If you're going to become really good at one thing, you have to really be focused on that one thing. And that's where I think being an owner, if you're going to step into ownership, especially if you're be an owner of a bigger practice, then ownership becomes your focus of being a great owner and not necessarily being a great clinician, because you're not being the clinician role anymore. You're doing, it's a different type of role. And so understanding that space and accepting that space, I think is a big part of that, where people probably struggle with a lot of just accepting that and kind of, yep, I can step into that, because it is unfamiliar territory. I can totally understand why people wouldn't want to do that, but I think that's a big part of where people struggle to reach out.
What are they most hopeful for?
Well, I think if you're working 70 or 80 hours a week, I would say you probably are hopeful to get some peace back and get some of your life back. But that would be me. But I guess if you're not that, maybe you value just the fact that you are able to make more money. I guess there's some of that. But because there's a financial component to some of this. I mean, I didn't mention it earlier, but like, onboard a therapist is somewhere between like $7,000 to $60,000 to onboard somebody, and depending on the practice, right? And again, that's credentialing, that's, get them up to speed, that's getting in clients, that's all that kind of stuff. So depending on how much you offer, that the price probably varies, but I would say probably they're most hopeful to try to establish some level of financial stability. But the other side of it, I think, is, at least I would hope, is that they're trying to improve their practice will meet the needs that they're trying to get to. Now, again, some practices that are not specialty practices probably have a greater sense of how can we impact the community. A lot of the ones I've worked for, even the ones I'm currently contracting with, they're really good at that. They're really good about establishing themselves in the community. But I think when you want to expand that, how you're going to expand it in order to be able to be most effective is really ultimately what you have to decide to do. And it's not just necessarily adding more people. And I think that's really where you were saying, what's something people don't really know about. It's that aspect. It's let me just kind of add more people to the practice with the idea that if I build it, they will come. And I think that's a lot of what we see with the virtual only platforms. Like virtual only platforms will ask you, hey, who do you want to work with? And you'll say, okay, I want to work with this population. Well, we'll hire you with the idea that we only have right now 2 people, but eventually there'll be more people here than just those 2 that you're going to give you initially. A lot of that's where a lot of that comes. Otherwise, you have a wait list of clinicians. You don't have a wait list of clients, and so we can't have that, right? We got to have something. We got to have more wait list of clients, obviously. So to what they hope for, I think, is that can the practice meet the needs of the community? Can it become more rounded? To what the vision is, and then also, like I said, trying to find some financial stability.
Do you have a framework or a philosophy that you consistently return to when you're working with mental health businesses?
I did develop one. So what I did is I took kind of a combination of some things I knew that had previously worked, and so I wanted to try to not minimize mental health by using this model, but one of the things I had took from was in Ypsilanti. So those for you who are familiar, Ypsilanti, they used to build B-24 bombers at the Willow Run Airport, and they did that during World War II. And so there was an 11 module, basically assembly line of how they would build the bombers. And so they would build all these pieces individually, and then they put them all together. So I kind of took the similar concept and tried to create this sort of basically a house framework of, the ownership is at the top, and then we have two like I talked about earlier, kind of a clinical director and like an admin kind of director, or like a everyday kind of like trying to, I don't exactly remember what my terminology was, but basically like an admin director and a clinical director, and they are the ones that create the roof over the rest of the foundation of the practice. So that includes safety for the clinicians, safety for clients. That includes we talked about meetings and those kind of things, a lot of that kind of stuff, more logistics. And so that whole framework is based on the same kind of concept. Is like, if you put this foundation in place of these execution type of work, if you have those being things that you're interested in continuing to foster in the practice, and then you have people overseeing that, but then underneath they're kind of carrying out the owner's vision, then that seems to be something that would create that structure you're looking for. Again, to try to say that works for every practice, probably doesn't. But could it be modified in different ways? I certainly think it could be. But the one of the things I've noticed is that, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, when you're in school, you don't learn how to run a practice, you learn how to run a session. And a lot of people base their businesses on a session. And so I just kind of decided, well, if I create a framework that has a little more business orientation based on what I feel like people are trying to get to, then that can be executed that way. And we know that, at least in a mechanical sense, that this model has worked in some previous types of fields. So that was kind of where I started from as far as my framework goes and what I kind of created in that sense. That part I don't talk much about, so that's why I don't have a lot of verbiage for you. So my apologies that I can't recall on
No,
that.
I think you're doing a really great job of kind of giving us a really clear idea of kind of what you're working on and what you're working toward and what you help practices do. And it's really great. For listeners who are therapists, supervisors, or owners, what can they begin paying attention to today that might shift the culture of their work environment?
I think it starts with observation. Certainly you want to come into a place and you want to look at what is going on, what's working, what is not working. Now you don't have to tear everything down to the floor, so to speak, but can you enter in and observe what you see? How do you see people interacting with one another? How do you see people? How do you see client retention? I mean, obviously it's a pretty big one people talk about. How do you see some of the things within the practice as far as, efficiency, follow up, I think is a big one. Again, Google reviews, the kind of things. What do clients say about things? If you can send out like a review of like, hey, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? Get some feedback from clients. I think those are some good kind of practical steps. And then taking that observation and going, okay, well, what do we need to prioritize in relation to our vision? So if our vision is to work with whatever, if it's to make more impact in the community, if it's to work with a specific diagnosis, if it's to implement a certain type of program, whatever that is, and then align that with where you're seeing these things that have been concerns and kind of, prioritize that number. If number one is if you're mostly concerned and connected with being a community-based organization and the community has a bad reputation, you have a bad reputation in the community, you got to fix that. Like that's got to be up there on the top. So it starts kind of with those, and that seems like it's a very logical step, but I think you have to kind of think through a little bit that way. And then observation can also tell you a lot about what, how people are interacting with one another. If you don't see good respect within the practice, within the people who are working there, if it's a big enough practice, how do you address that? You got to start looking at, okay, well, what are concerns within this? And maybe it is we have to meet as a practice wide meeting of, okay, like what do we need to change here? But I do think it starts with observation and kind of noticing what you see and what feelings do you get from that? Because again, we deal in the world of feelings, but I think as a clinician, sometimes we can kind of put down our own feelings because we're used to doing that as a clinician in that sense. But when we're outside the door of it, what feelings do we get in our own space, right? And that can tell us a lot about the way the safety is around for other people.
If you could offer our listeners one practice, reflection, or a small daily action that they might try each day for the next week, something that supports their energy, boundaries, or workflow, what would you choose and why?
I think, I guess the one thing that comes to mind is as an owner, can I, where do I see myself slowing down? And so do I need to give myself that space of like breaking? Like, so for example, do I need to give myself, 10 minutes of my time to recenter? Do I need to give myself a conversation? Do I need to have a conversation with people who are in charge of my practice? Do I need to focus on, reevaluate how much time I am working independently? Do I need to evaluate how much time I'm spending with other people that are within the practice, that kind of thing. It's not overly practical or overly boundary oriented, but the idea is like, can I start to slow down? I think that the faster we go, then we tend to go faster and faster and faster to the point that we are out of control. So it's always a good idea to slow down, ground yourself, put yourself in a position where you're focusing on what's in front of you. I think the more you're focused on your future tripping or on past tripping, what you didn't get to do, what you'd like to do, what you think the business is going to look like, you're going to be focused on the wrong things because the things that are right in front of you are probably the things that you really need to be most oriented with. Does that mean they're all bad? No, but it also doesn't mean they might be all good either. And so maybe not even labeling those things. The practical part might be, okay, these are what they are, right? They're not bad or good, but they're things that I see that are not in line with what I want this to look like. And so what can I start to do to practically start to change that? I have to make a little bit of a game plan, right? We make treatment plans for clients. How do I put a treatment plan in place for our practice? Well, it starts with really identifying what are really the symptoms. And again, if I don't see what the symptoms are because I'm too busy focusing on stuff that isn't in front of me, I'm probably going to end up losing sight of where I really need to be. So I think slowing down is a big part of as an owner. What can I start to do? And again, practically doing that through what we teach clients, right? Grounding, reflection, journaling, whatever that looks like, those kind of things where it works for you is part of that. And so maybe even doing that in the perspective of an owner, not necessarily as a clinician or as an individual, doing that more in that perspective of being an owner.
So I offer that to all of you out there listening. I want you to give that a try for the next week. Each day, I want you to take Patrick's advice and really take a look at where can I slow down, and take some time to be present with that. For clinicians or practice owners that are listening today who might feel exhausted, discouraged, or maybe unsure of where to begin, what message would you want to give them today?
Well, let's first start with is that, there is no blueprint for ownership, at least not as a clinician, right? There's a blueprint for business and there's a blueprint for running sessions and there's blueprint for supporting clients, but there's not a lot of blueprints about how to run your practice. And it seems like a lot of times that, your business can look a lot like, or your practice can look a lot like the same chaos that may feel like you're in your own life and how that spills over. And those boundaries can be really hard to sometimes, maintain. But I'd say that, again, you're not alone in that because there's certainly a lot of our people who feel like that their practice may not be what they'd like it to be. And that's true for us as human beings, right? When we have clients that come in, they want to go to a certain direction, they want to get there fast. We all want to do that same as owners. We want to get to the most sort of peaceful place we can to some degree. It takes time, and I think it takes patience, and I guess I'd say perseverance, really, as an owner, to continue to get to that point. And so really what getting up and doing it the next day is really kind of the best thing you can continue to do. If you just stop, or you say, hey, I'm not going to address these things, or I'm not going to try to find resources or other people to help me, then you're going to end up continuing to see the chaos, because it's not going to go in a better direction. It's just going to, there's no, as much as I'd like to believe as a human being, there's a plateau, there really isn't. It's either we're getting better, we're getting worse. And I think that's very true for practices in that sense. Like either they're moving in a positive direction. And again, it might be a lot of ups and downs. It's going to be a lot of hills and valleys in that same idea. But that doesn't mean that the upward trajectory isn't there. And I think sometimes it's hard to see that because, again, financial concerns, or maybe clients not coming in, or therapists leaving, whatever the reasons are. And that gets discouraging. So I definitely feel like, understand yourself as an owner, understand yourself as a human being in that, and recognize that, like, hey, you're trying to move toward a better place, and that you're not alone in that. And so if you're going to continue to do that, again, the perseverance of that is every day. And it will get there. It's just a matter of, it may not look the way we want it to look, but can it look like, how do we understand success in the sense that it may not necessarily be our version of success, but the version of success that other people may benefit from through whatever those struggles might be as an owner in that way. So don't give up on that sense, right? Keep moving forward.
Patrick, thank you so much for such an illuminating conversation today. Your work reminds us that healing isn't only for clients, right? It must include the
Absolutely.
people who hold the space. For listeners who want to learn more about Patrick's work, including Blue Mark's concepts in coaching and his Patreon offerings, you'll find his link in the show notes. Thank you for joining us today on NeuroAlchemy, a Neurosynergy podcast. I'm Dr. Sarah Young, and until next time, may you continue listening inward, honoring your energy, and becoming who you're meant to be. And if this episode was helpful for you, please like and share and subscribe, because that is how we spread the word. Bye, everyone.